So, dear ladies and gentlemen, it's my great pleasure to welcome you all here and also those who join online via the live stream. My name is Björn Bartling. I'm a professor here at the Department of Economics and the Vice Chair of the department. It's my great pleasure to welcome our guest tonight, Sir Oliver Hart. He's the recipient of the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2016 that he received together with Bengt Holmström for their fundamental contributions to contract theory. And Oliver's work rests on the idea that contracts are necessarily incomplete, and his work circles around the consequences that this contract incompleteness has. And he thought about ways to mitigate these issues. The classic hold-up problem. So the problem is if there are relationship-specific investments, when two parties write a contract, that one party can then exploit the other when unforeseen contingencies arise. Later in his work, Oliver kind of captured the idea that people might not necessarily be so selfish that they would always exploit loopholes in contracts, but he developed the idea that contracts might serve as reference points, and if then unforeseen contingencies arise, people negotiate around these reference points, but they might feel shortchanged, so they care about things like fairness and equity and might react in reciprocal ways, so might try to punish the other party if they think that they are not getting what they deserve. And this idea that people might not be entirely selfish is also behind the work that we are going to hear about today, from the field of corporate governance. It rests on the idea that investors might not be solely interested in profits, but that they might have broader goals. So these are the citizen investors. The talk is based on a forthcoming book, actually, of the same title, work with Luigi Zingales, who we had here at the center quite a while ago, and also on work with Elaine Landemore, and she was at our center actually quite recently. Okay, before we start, some technical information. So during the talk, you can already submit questions online via menti.com, and I have the Menti code here. It is 42410740, and on this platform you can ask questions, and if you don't have a question on your own, you can also vote for questions. That's, I guess, an idea that's common here in Switzerland, so it won't be only this investor kind of democracy that we are going to hear about, but also audience democracy. Okay, so I would say, without further ado, I will hand over to the Nobel laureate of the year 2016, Oliver Hart. So the floor is yours.
I hope everybody can. Oh, I was going to say I hope everybody can hear me. Maybe can you hear me now? Yes. Okay. Thank you, Björn, for that very nice introduction to my work. And let me say it's a great pleasure and honor to be speaking to you tonight. I've had a great few days in Zurich. I attended a very interesting conference celebrating Ernst Fehr's 70th birthday. I also managed to swim in the river once, not quite understanding how the current worked, so I was a little alarmed at some point. I thought I might never get out and be able to speak to you today, but I managed it, and I also swam in the lake. So tonight, my talk is called Citizen Investors, and as Björn said, this is based on joint work with Luigi Zingales, and some of it also with Elaine Landemore. Okay, so let's jump in. More and more people invest in the stock market these days, many through their pensions. This is true of 60% of Americans, and increasing number of Europeans, and surely people all over the world. Now, it's not difficult to get advice on how to invest. There are lots of books about that, and you can easily find a financial advisor to help you. But I'm aware of no book that tells ordinary investors that their shares come with votes, and that this gives them some power and also perhaps some responsibility to influence what companies do. Now, these days, most people hold shares through intermediaries. So in the US, but maybe also elsewhere, the examples of these intermediaries are mutual funds like BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street. They are the most important and are called the big three, but also through pension funds, which in turn may use these intermediaries. And these intermediaries vote, because I said shares come with votes, right? But in fact, if you invest through these intermediaries, traditionally you never get to vote, and you probably never even know that there's any voting happening, because the intermediaries vote on your behalf in board elections and on shareholder proposals. And as I said, most people just have no clue that this is going on. So how has this situation arisen, or why has it arisen? I think one answer is that according to the conventional wisdom, investors want companies to make the highest financial return possible. That's what everybody out there believes, almost everybody, economists, finance people, lawyers, practitioners. Well, if that's the case, so we already know what the investors want, what the shareholders want, then we should let the professionals help them to carry out this goal. And who are the professionals? They are the mutual fund managers. So that's why it makes sense for them to vote on our behalf, to elect the appropriate boards of directors who will choose the appropriate CEOs to maximize financial return. So everything looks good. Now, where does this conventional wisdom come from? Where does it come from? I think actually there are multiple sources, but no one has had a bigger role than Milton Friedman. In an incredibly influential 1970 New York Times article, he wrote, and I'm going to quote this, "In a free enterprise private property system, a corporate executive is an employee of the owners of the business. He has direct responsibility to his employers. That responsibility is to conduct the business in accordance with their desires, which generally will be to make as much money as possible while conforming to the basic rules of the society, both those embodied in law and those embodied in ethical custom." Well, here he is, the great man. Now, Friedman, it sounds as I'm saying, as if he thought people are only interested in money. No, that's not the case. He recognized that shareholders are people, the ultimate shareholders behind the intermediaries. They're people like us. And we care about money, but we also care about other things. We have social goals. His argument, his point, was that we could achieve these by ourselves. We don't need companies to do it for us. At the time Friedman was writing, a big issue was whether corporations should give to charity. And Friedman's argument is that they should not. It's better for a company to pay a higher dividend, and then each shareholder can decide what fraction of that to give to their favorite charity, rather than the company doing it on their behalf, in which case it's probably going to go to the CEO's favorite charity. So in this example, he's very persuasive. To use economic jargon, companies do not have a comparative advantage relative to shareholders, to individuals, in giving to charity, so they should stay out of this. Now, Luigi and I, in several papers and in our forthcoming book, Citizen Investors, argue that charitable contributions are a very special case. Companies may not have a comparative advantage in giving to charity, but they do in other activities, and then Friedman's argument breaks down. So let me give you a simple example. Suppose you own a dry cleaning business, and you can make more money by dumping a side product, a hazardous chemical, in the local river. Suppose it's not illegal, but you know that people downstream will suffer. Do you do it? Some people may answer yes, but many will say no. Now, in contrast to the charity case, the dry cleaner does have a comparative advantage in avoiding pollution. It's much more efficient for the dry cleaner not to dump than to dump, and for the owner, or maybe several owners, if there are, to use the higher dividend they get to spend on cleaning up activities. I mean, apart from the coordination problem when you have many shareholders, there's also the simple fact that the cost of cleaning up may far exceed the profit the company gets from dumping in the first place. So the implication is that a socially responsible owner might decide not to dump the chemicals, even though this does not maximize profit. Friedman is wrong. Now, Luigi and I have argued that companies should maximize shareholder welfare rather than profit or shareholder value. So, like Friedman, we stick to the idea that companies should act on behalf of shareholders. So, of course, some people want to go further. They want to say that companies should act on behalf of stakeholders, more generally, or maybe even society. Of course, there are some things which are attractive about that, but we think it's going too far. We want to stick with the current governance system, and most companies are set up in such a way that it seems they're meant to act on behalf of shareholders. Shareholders are the one group of stakeholders that are given votes, and we're not going to interfere with that. We're sticking with that. But what we're doing, where we're being a bit radical, is to say shareholders may have more complicated goals than just maximizing financial return. As in my dry cleaning example, if they're socially responsible, they might actually want the company not to dump the chemicals, even though that's profit maximizing. So we say companies should maximize shareholder welfare. Shareholder welfare includes profit, but it also takes into account shareholders' moral preferences, how much they are willing to accept a lower financial return for the greater good. Let me take another example, which is more sort of real world, if you like. Consider what happened in 2022. Oxfam put forward a shareholder proposal at Pfizer and Moderna, asking those companies to share the patents of their COVID-19 vaccines with African countries, which I interpret to mean having them make that vaccine available at cost. So I don't think they weren't asking them to lose money, but they were asking them not to make money out of Africa. Now, this is a very interesting example of comparative advantage. So imagine that the shareholders of these companies are somewhat socially responsible, so they care about people getting COVID in Africa. So, the Friedman sort of strategy would, the companies maximize profit, pay a higher dividend. The shareholders then take that dividend, the extra dividend they're getting from operations in Africa, and hand it back to African countries. But if you've studied basic economics, you can see the flaw in that argument, because profit-maximizing companies that have some monopoly power, which these companies obviously did, are going to set price above marginal cost, above cost. And what that means is even if you give all the profit to the Africans, they're still going to be buying the vaccine at price above cost, which means they won't be buying the efficient amount. The socially efficient amount would only be achieved if they are faced with a price equal to cost. And so again, this is a case where who gets to control whether price is above cost or equal to cost? It's these companies. These companies have a comparative advantage. In fact, they're uniquely positioned to do it. And that's why the shareholder resolution makes sense. you might be thinking so far, well, maybe he's got a point here, that companies should be maximizing something other than financial return or shareholder value. But we're not really sure that shareholders are that socially responsible. So, it's a nice idea, but it's not going to change anything. Well, there's increasing evidence, actually, that shareholders are willing to sacrifice some financial return for a social objective. Let me just give 2 pieces of evidence, although I could certainly give more. So the shareholder proposals I just mentioned from Oxfam actually achieved significant support, 27.3% and 24% respectively at the Pfizer and Moderna shareholder meetings. Now, it's not a majority, but actually I'll come back in a few minutes to explain possibly why it wasn't a majority. But anyway, it's significant. So these are people who are willing to give up some profit for the greater good. To take a second example, in 2024, there was a pension fund in the Netherlands that was considering whether to do more impact investing with the pension money. And they were a little concerned about doing this without consulting the investors. So they did consult them. And they said, do you want us to do more impact investing? They explained that this might lower their financial return. And, here we're talking about people's pensions. So people often say, oh, when it comes to pensions, people are not going to give up any money. But in fact, they were willing to do it. So the majority voted to increase impact investing, even though, as I say, they were told that this might reduce financial return. Okay. If you accept the argument so far, then companies need to find out their shareholders' preferences. They can't just assume that they want to maximize financial return as the conventional wisdom has it. They should find out about their social preferences, and so should the intermediaries through which many of us hold shares and that vote and engage with companies on our behalf. As an example, did the big 3, Vanguard, BlackRock, State Street, did they consult their investors, their beneficiaries, before voting on the Pfizer and Moderna proposals? Well, I have to tell you the bad news. They all voted against, A, and B, they never consulted anybody. They certainly didn't consult me, and I am a shareholder in those companies simply because I invest in Vanguard's S&P Standard & Poor's 500 index fund, which has these companies. Vanguard never asked me how I felt about it. So the point is that those numbers in the 20s of the support that those proposals got, I think one can pretty much assume that those came from direct investors, those people who invest directly in companies rather than through mutual funds. So if the big 3 had consulted their shareholders, their investors, and perhaps found a majority liked the proposal and had voted for it instead of voting against it, they have about 29% of the votes. So that would have would have led to a majority being in favor. But it never happened. Okay, so companies should find out what their shareholders want, what kind of trade-offs they're willing to make. So should intermediaries. Now, how can they do it? Well, one possibility is something called pass-through voting. So the way this works, I'm here talking about the intermediaries. The way this works, that Vanguard, say, decides that previously it's been voting, the votes that come with the shares you have through Vanguard, but now it's going to let you do it. So if you own 1,000 shares in the Vanguard S&P 500 index fund, it turns out you indirectly own approximately 80 shares of Microsoft. So as I say, until recently, Vanguard would decide how to cast these 80 votes at the Microsoft shareholder meeting. Now they say, Oliver, you can do it. Actually, they realized that if they did this for all 500 companies, there's no way I would do it, because that's just an awful lot of voting, and I've got other things to do with my life. So that wouldn't work. So what they did was to provide some guidelines that I can select. So basically, I'm delegating my vote to somebody else. I could go into much more detail on this, but I don't think it's a good thing to do given time constraints. So let me just say that two things. First of all, the guidelines they offered were very boring. Second, maybe because of that, or maybe for other reasons, the take-up rate of this has been very small among retail investors. In other words, among small investors like me. Some institutions that also invest in companies through Vanguard, so they're much bigger players, they have taken the opportunity to choose pass-through voting, but the small investors have not. And this actually is quite easy to explain. It's just a rational apathy argument. I mean, I'm a small investor. Vanguard offers me this choice to do the voting myself, and I think to myself, what impact is my vote going to have on anything? None. I'm much, much too small. So, does it even make sense for me to bother to select a guideline? No. I'm not even going to spend, it turns out, the 5 minutes to do that. Instead, I'm just going to say to Vanguard, you keep voting on my behalf. It's not irrational. It doesn't lead to a very good outcome, but it is individually rational. And that's what we have seen so far. Okay, so I don't think pass-through voting is the solution to the problem of getting investor shareholder voices heard. I want to propose something else, which is an investor assembly. And this is where Hélène Landemore comes in. And Luigi and I teamed up with her, and we've written a paper which you can find on my website. And the reason we teamed up with her is she's an expert on citizens' assemblies. So let me come to that. Our idea of an investor assembly or a shareholder assembly is inspired by citizens' assemblies, which have been used in the political context. So what are they? A citizens' assembly is a body of individuals chosen at random from the relevant population to deliberate on important social and political issues. So in the case of investors, they'll be deliberating about something else. But citizens' assemblies are set up to deliberate on some important social and political issue, which is very tough to resolve. So, okay, for those of you who know history, this is not a new idea. They were popular in ancient Greece over 2,000 years ago, fell out of favor, but are now coming back. Think of large juries aimed to capture the full diversity of a population and ideally offer an accurate demographic mini portrait of it. Now, unlike juries, participation is voluntary. So to give you some examples of citizens' assemblies, there are two famous examples in Ireland because they really were extremely successful. So Ireland used to have an incredibly restrictive abortion law. It was one of the most restrictive in the world, and there was a feeling that something should change, but politicians were scared to touch it, given that Ireland is a highly Catholic country. So they decided to set up a citizens' assembly, which heard, so I think in that case it was about 100 people, heard testimony on both sides of the issue from experts, deliberated, met in person, met in online as well, and eventually came up with a recommendation for a new abortion law, which then went to a referendum of the whole Irish people and was passed. So I realize, I'm speaking in Switzerland, and you love referenda. And there was a referendum at the end of this, but there was a citizens' assembly first. And they had another one on marriage equality, which also led to recommendations which were endorsed by a referendum of the whole Irish population. There have been a couple in France, which actually Hélène, my co-author, Luigi's my co-author, she's been involved in them, in organizing them. One of them was on climate justice, and the Assembly came up with some proposals. This was after the Yellow Vest movement, Gilets jaunes, if that's, I got that right. And the proposals did not go to a referendum, so that wasn't part of the plan. Instead, they went through the legislature, and some of the recommendations were implemented. There was a second one on end-of-life issues, and that's still to be acted on. There are many other examples of them, and increasingly many. So what we do here is we're proposing to apply this idea to the investor context. So it probably makes most sense to do it at the intermediary level rather than the company level in the first instance. So let me explain how that might work. So let's take Vanguard and its S&P 500 index fund, so holding the 500 biggest, most important, or most valuable companies in the US. What Vanguard could do, this is what we're proposing, is they could randomly choose 150 of the investors in this fund. Now, in order to persuade them to do the work, they're going to compensate them, and they're going to pay all their expenses. Before the lottery, each investor will be offered the opportunity to opt out and do their own voting. So you're not forced to be part of this, but our expectation is that many small investors will choose to be part of it, or will not choose not to be part of it. Now, here we have an interesting, decision to make, because there's a little bit of a conflict between the citizen case and the investor case. So in the case of citizens, we're sort of familiar with the idea of one person, one vote. In the case of finance, we're more familiar with one share, one vote. So how do we navigate between these two? We came up with the idea that someone with a greater investment in the S&P 500 fund should have a higher probability of being chosen, but once in the assembly, it's one person, one vote. So I think people who are familiar with citizens' assemblies have the view that having some people in that assembly with more votes would be really terrible for deliberation. It would sort of disrupt the whole thing. So we don't want to do that, but we do have this higher probability. Now, it's also the case that if you're a really significant shareholder in the fund, you might well, if you're an institution, for example, you will surely decide to opt out of this and do your own voting. So this is really only for the small people. Now, okay, people in the assembly will be provided with informational resources, briefing materials, and access to experts. They'll meet online and in person to discuss and deliberate. And they will make, the idea is they're going to make recommendations about Vanguard's voting and engagement strategy going forward, how it should vote on certain issues. So here are some examples of what it might consider. It might consider whether Vanguard should support shareholder proposals calling on companies to stop certain kinds of lobbying activity. For example, Exxon and other oil companies lobby against sensible climate regulation. That's a fact. And Assembly members might say, well, that's great for the bottom line of Exxon, but it's terrible for us as citizens. You know, we're living in the world. We don't want it to get too hot, although it does seem to be that way right now. Fortunately not in here, but outside. We don't like that. It's bad for us. It's bad for our children, our grandchildren. We may even care a bit about people not related to us, future generations. So actually, we would like Exxon to stop doing that. Now, they may not decide that. Maybe the assembly is full of, you know, maybe the Vanguard investors are very self-interested on average and very focused on money. Maybe they're living in a place where climate change isn't an issue. And so they might say, no, drill baby, drill. Just keep lobbying and we don't want any We're very happy with you opposing carbon taxes and the like. We don't know, they're never asked. This is a way to find out. As a second example, this assembly might consider whether Vanguard should push food or beverage companies that design products to be addictive to change the ingredients or put warning signs on the packets. The Assembly might consider whether Vanguard should support shareholder proposals to treat animals more humanely in food production. I'm going to come back to that example in a moment. So, okay, criticisms. One of the main criticisms of citizens' assemblies, and surely it'll be of investor assemblies, is that randomly drawn people don't have the expertise to make competent decisions. But I want to stress, investor assemblies will not be asked to calculate the optimal hedging strategy against interest rate risk. Instead, they will be asked if they are willing to accept a lower return to treat animals more humanely, etc. Things like that. Now, they're going to listen to experts. So some experts can tell them what the extra cost of treating animals more humanely will be, how much their dividend's going to fall. Welfare animal specialists can tell them about how much animals feel pain and how much less pain they would feel if they are treated more humanely. The final trade-off, though, is a values trade-off. It's a moral decision. And who is making those decisions now? They're being made by company boards, boards of directors, or asset managers. But these people were never picked for their moral aptitude. Nobody is better qualified to make these decisions than the ultimate investors, who also suffer the economic consequences of the decisions. Okay, well, you might be thinking, what a great idea this is. I mean, you might not, but I'm sort of hoping you do think that. But you might be thinking, it would never work. Well, no, it does work, because it has worked. It turns out that in early 2024, following work by Emmeline Cooper and Rob Bauer, a Dutch pension fund organized an investor assembly to discuss responsible investments. 55 investors, so a smaller number than I would like, from the pension fund were randomly drawn and brought to the city of Utrecht for 3 different days, during which they approved 49 proposals for responsible investment to submit to the board. Many of these proposals have been adopted. Indeed, this is actually the very same pension fund that was in the earlier slide. So an important proposal was to increase impact investing, and the pension fund was reluctant to do that just on the basis of what 55 people said. So they went back to all their investors, and as I said, the investors voted in favor of this. Actually, what Luigi, Ellen, and I are interested in is less what kind of investment you make, because, for example, with the Vanguard S&P 500 index fund, there's no question about that. They have to invest in these 500 companies, and they have to do it proportional to the value of the company. So there's no flexibility on that. But there is flexibility on how they vote and engage, and that's what we think the Investor Assembly is about. And Emmeline has now, actually, it's now in the past, she's run an Investor Assembly for a much larger UK pension fund called Nest. So it does seem to be possible. Okay, let me wrap up. Companies do many good things for society. So this is not at all an attack on companies. As you know, we know they do produce wonderful innovations. We love their products and all that. But they also cause major problems. Now, economists usually take the view that preventing the bad things is the job of government. So this is the idea that the government regulates, it imposes Pigouvian taxes to deal with externalities and all the rest of it. It's a very nice idea, but I don't think it works in practice. Government often fails to do its job, not least because companies subvert it. So, you know, the idea is government's going to deal with the externalities, and then companies can just maximize profit, right? That's the sort of wisdom among economists. But it ignores the fact, this is fine if the government is independent of the companies. But if the companies, in the name of profit maximization, are lobbying the government and giving campaign contributions in such a way that the government doesn't do the optimal regulation, well, then we're in a different world. And then actually the only group that can stop this may be the shareholders of these companies who actually have the power to say, stop doing this. Okay, so I think I've covered the rest of it. So investor assemblies, so we think, as I say, companies defend their actions by saying that they are acting on behalf of their shareholders when they maximize profit. But as I've tried to argue, there's no reason to think this is the case, that this is what shareholders want. And so we need to hear from shareholders what they want, and investor assemblies are a way for this to be done. And we like to think that giving investors a voice can curb corporate misbehavior and lead to a better world. But even if it doesn't do that, it will lead to a more democratic world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Oliver, for a very interesting talk. May you join me here? So before we take questions from the audience and also from the mentee, let me ask you a question and take up what you had on your last wrap-up slide, and a quote that's also on the invitation here that we all took. And we usually take the view that preventing bad things is the job of government, and you say that's basically wrong, because the companies can capture the government. So what would prevent that they also capture this assembly?
Well, first of all, if it's set up by Vanguard, say, or BlackRock or State Street, I would be less worried about that, because I'm not convinced that of course it does depend on how it's set up, but I mean, our proposal is that these assemblies should have a lot of control. So they get to decide. So, I mean, you've raised an interesting point. I mean, there's one way of setting up this would be you tell the assembly what they're going to consider. You will consider humane treatment of animals, and that's it, right? That would be a way of making sure they don't talk about lobbying or anything like that. Okay, so we definitely don't want that to be the case. We want the assembly to be set up. Our idea is there would be one every year, in the fall of every year, because then they can consider what proposals are coming up or have come up in the past and are likely to still be issues in the coming year. They could also actually even ask Vanguard to put up proposals itself, which doesn't happen right now. Could happen, though. And we want to make sure they have the freedom to decide what issues to consider. So that's a very important part of it.
Yes, so someone has to set the agendas, select the expert who are the
It's going to be them. They will do
themselves.
It. Yes, they will do it. I'm actually involved right now in a citizens' assembly through Elaine Landemore. There's going to be one in Connecticut, which I'm not, I don't live there, but I'm still a little bit helping to organize it. Others are doing much more. And that's going to be 100 people who are going to deliberate about local public services in Connecticut and how they should be financed. Right now, it's mainly through property taxes, but that could change. And it's clear that, I mean, it's going to be very important that the assembly itself very quickly gets control. So, not in the first hour, because they have to get their act together, but control is going to move from the organizers to them very quickly. Okay. I mean, another way, perhaps another response, I'm not so sure that the intermediaries would be so keen for this not to happen. I mean, the pension fund in the Netherlands and in the UK, they both decided it would be a good idea to find out what their beneficiaries wanted.
Okay, because they could also kind of put the responsibility on the shareholders and say we now learn what they want, so we don't have to take unusual decisions ourselves that we might have to defend.
See, you're assuming everyone's self-interested, right?
Am I? Usually I'm
well,
not.
you know, you think these people are going to subvert it, but you know, I think maybe there are enough decent people that once they see the light, they realize that the shareholders and the beneficiaries deserve to have a voice.
Mm-hmm. Okay, you were talking a lot about comparative advantage, and I was thinking, I mean, for example, the shareholders having a comparative advantage in deciding to which charity to give. That's very convincing. That also the dry cleaner has a comparative advantage of not polluting in the first place, because that's more efficient than cleaning up later on. So I thought the government also has some comparative advantage in regulating externalities, because it can set rules that then govern kind of everybody's pollution. That seemed like a first best solution, but you're assuming the government is easy to capture, and given that problem, the citizen assembly is kind of a second best solution.
Well, the two go together. Okay, I'm not trying to say we don't need the government anymore. I'm trying to liberate the government
Okay.
through the investor assembly is ideally would stop these companies doing bad lobbying. Not all lobbying is bad. Some lobbying is, you know, informational and can be justified, and, you know, I'm not against all of it, but some of it I think is bad. And if the investor assembly achieves getting rid of that, then the government can do the kind of regulation economists think it can do.
Less influenced by lobbyists.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, let me open the floor to questions. We have a fellow Nobel Prize winner here in the front, and I think we also have a microphone.
I think this is overall a laudable proposal, and as somebody who has been rationally apathetic for many years, I feel that maybe next time I get these things from Vanguard, I should respond to them. But there's something that bothers me about this, and maybe you can tell me a little bit more about the nitty-gritty of the proposal, and that is there a possibility of reversing the decision if the shareholders actually discover more information about the actual consequences of their vote? So suppose they say, look, we're willing to take a decline in the rate of return if you do this and that, you know, but we don't know exactly how much. So a year or two later, they know how much, and they say, oh my God, if I'd known it was going to be this big, I might have voted differently. But I don't see, actually, in anything you said, an opportunity for the shareholders themselves to take an initiative and say, okay, we have buyer's remorse and we would like to have another vote.
Well, couldn't the next year's investor assembly reconsider the issue? That's what I would. Yeah, I think that's always possible.
Yeah, but then you're back to where you started, which is these investor assemblies are not representing sufficiently the small investors. So I wonder if
sorry, they got it right the first time. The world changes, or they learn more information.
Yes.
Right, as you say. In your case, the cost was higher than they thought. So that same investor assembly, if they'd known the true cost, I thought in your example, they would have reached a different decision. Exactly. Well, so next year there's going to be an investor assembly. It'll be a different group because we don't want to have the same people there. Otherwise they could be captured. But there's going to be, it's very likely that next group will say, let's reconsider this thing, which has turned out to be much more expensive, and we're now going to recommend that the company changes course.
But then they will repeat, essentially, the procedure that you outlined, and again choose these people randomly and have an investors assembly and so on. Is that the idea then? that this is a random selection of
150 people.
will be repeated if anybody asks for it.
Every year, you have a new randomly chosen group.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so that's part of the proposal then.
Yes, because we don't want kind of careerist people. We don't, yeah, it's very important that nobody's there long enough to be influenced by outside parties.
Right.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, let me take a question here from people who join online. So one question is, what about companies where the ownership is very concentrated? Like SpaceX here, it says. Can it be a solution or something that works in that case? We can also use the other microphone for you. Someone is coming. Okay, so the question was about constant. Yeah.
You know, it's an important question. The honest answer is nothing you can do in that case. I mean, if someone retains control, you know, through dual class or something like that, which is increasingly popular, at least for some companies, then the minority shareholders who would form the investor assembly, doesn't matter what they come up with. I mean, it might still be useful for informational purposes, but of course the controller can just ignore it. And because we are not willing to, or at least I'm reluctant to interfere with corporate governance arrangements, right? So I sort of take the way you set up a company is, well, that's your choice, and we have to live with it. So in that case, I see little role for an investor assembly. But I think it's still the case that although there are prominent companies like that, there are an awful lot of companies that are not like that. And it may be, you know, there are also costs of setting up companies in this way. You know, maybe if you're Musk, you can get away with anything, but not everybody can. And it's also, some people are proposing, which I have mixed feelings about, but some people are proposing that with those companies, the dual class should be time limited. So after 5 or 10 years or something like that, it should disappear. We're not at that point, and I'm not, you know, as I say, I'm not sure how I feel about that. But if that happened, of course, it would be less of a problem.
I see. Okay, let me take maybe a question from the lady in yellow over here.
I was just wondering, as part of your investor assembly, if you could actually get 3 different kinds of investors that were working along different time horizons, because it seems principally this is led by principal appreciation of the stock. But if you move on to pensions, then you have those that are more, you know, middle to long-term investors. So when you set up the investor assembly, would you or have you considered representation from those with different timelines?
So you're asking whether the assembly should be, you know, when we randomly select, we should have a spread, you know, short-term, long-term. So it's a very interesting idea. I'm inclined not to do that because I think, actually, I think, you know what, I think that well, I think with pension plans, I think the pension examples I mentioned, they may have done it by age as well. So it's an interesting possibility. It's a little interfering with shareholder democracy. That's why but I think it could be part of it. Yeah.
Yeah. Because it's like principal appreciation versus dividend income in the middle to long term, and it's possibly also about the impact on the environment and all of that, but that might probably come through much later. So myopic principal appreciation versus medium to long term dividend appreciation.
It can help. I think it makes more sense with pension funds than with just regular mutual funds, to be honest. And yeah, so I agree with you that a long-run perspective can help with some of these problems, but I would like to suggest that it's not enough just to... So, you know, it is also the case that when you listen to companies, CEOs, and they talk about what they're doing, they often at least talk about long-run shareholder value as opposed to short-run shareholder value, which is, of course, for economists a little puzzling, because many of us sort of think the stock market's pretty efficient, in which case there shouldn't really be a difference between short-run and long-run value. But it's amazing how many CEOs claim there is a difference. But, you know, there are also many examples of... so, I'm sorry, this is not really... I'm taking off from your question to, you know, a lot of people say, you know, you're exaggerating the problem, because if a company does bad stuff, it's going to suffer in the long run. So as long as it's not a short-run player, then, you know, if it pollutes, it's going to pay a cost eventually anyway. I think there are many examples where that is not true. To choose some very you know, obvious ones and perhaps some of the worst ones, you know, leading American companies collaborated with the Nazi regime during the 1930s. So IBM supplied computer equipment to them. GM provided tanks to them before America entered the war. And this was probably, it seems to have been profit maximizing. These companies never seem to have paid any serious penalty from doing that. Sorry, it's a little bit of a tangent, but your question made me think of it.
Okay, so while actually the microphone goes to Maya here in front, I will take a question that keeps being voted up, but even though I think you talked about it, so the question here is from our online viewers, so what the implication of the rise in passive investment in ETFs has for your ideas. I think you talked about it.
Yeah, I think it makes the ideas more relevant, because with passive investing, so, you know, one thing people say is, well, you know, if a company's doing a bad thing and you don't like it, just sell your shares, right? That is the traditional approach. Of course, if you do that as a small shareholder, you're going to have absolutely no impact on the company. You know, if I don't like what Exxon's doing and I'm a shareholder of Exxon, I sell my Exxon shares. Somebody else will buy them, and that person presumably doesn't care what Exxon is doing. So if anything, Exxon's behavior is going to get worse. They're going to have sort of less moral people who are shareholders of Exxon. Now, but when it comes to index funds, even that argument doesn't work, because we're now all advised to invest in index funds. That means you don't get to choose which company. So this is passive investing. Yes. You're going to hold the 500 companies, or maybe it's a Vanguard total stock market index fund, in which case you hold every public company in America, and you're just going to hold them in fixed proportions. The only thing you can do is engage. That's the only action you have.
And otherwise, you're being replaced by less moral investors. Yes. Okay, Maya.
So thank you. This was a really thought-provoking proposal, and I enjoyed thinking about it. I wanted to question your assumption that citizen investors lack the expertise to compute the profit-maximizing strategy and should therefore delegate that to the experts, but at the same time have the capacity to compute the welfare-maximizing strategy and should therefore figure that out themselves through deliberation. Now, to me, the second question seems orders of magnitude more difficult than the first one, right? Because when we think about profits, that's, a component of welfare, but welfare has these other profits, and there's these non-trivial ethical questions of how to balance these different things. And so I wanted to ask why you view sort of the first question of profit maximizing as one which citizens should appropriately delegate to experts, while the second question is one where people should look into their hearts and deliberate rather than deferring to experts. Thank you.
Sure. Well, I mean, so when it comes to, how to run an organization well, as a shareholder of some company, I mean, I haven't a clue, right? There are people who spend their lives in that company, and I would assume they know it's better if, some layer of middle managers is replaced or not. I mean, they may get it wrong, but they surely have a better sense of that than I could possibly have as an outsider. So that's why I think we delegate things to managers and to boards. The other thing, though, is I'm not sure it is that difficult because, I mean, I'll give you another example. In 1984, DuPont dumped toxic waste into the Ohio River from the production of PFOA, which is a forever chemical. And it turned out that we actually have done the calculations on this because there was litigation later. It turned out that it would have cost them $19 million at the time, 1984 dollars, to incinerate the waste rather than dumping it in the river. Dumping it in the river led to a great deal of illness and death. Now, imagine that shareholders at the time had been confronted with this decision. Of course, they never were. So it would end up being a choice of whether, it turns out we worked out that for a sort of reasonable sized shareholder of this company, this cost would have meant for them 19 cents reduction in their dividend, present value of the dividend. Now, of course, it's $1984, so 19 cents really meant something then, but no, not that much, okay? Pretty small. So they would have had to pay 19 cents as a small shareholder, and the result would have been, and unfortunately I don't have the numbers here, but many lives saved, many fewer cases of this kind of cancer, and all the rest of it. Okay, so just imagine you're confronted with that choice. Is it very difficult to decide what to do in a case like that? You don't even have to put a value, you could go further and say, how much is each life worth? Let's put, $10 million, 2026 dollars. But you don't even have to do that. Before you see, it's a no-brainer. Unless you're the most selfish person in the world, you would say, please don't do it. And that seems to me, I think ordinary people are very, very capable of that kind of thing.
Thank you. I think just to clarify, I mean, in this example, obviously, it seems very straightforward, but figuring out the consequences of dumping the thing into the river and the mortality that would induce, I mean, that does seem like a complicated problem.
Well, okay, yes, that's an important point. But that's where the experts come in. After all, the company is meant to figure that out, right? That should be part of their calculation. Even, by the way, if they were thinking about damages they might have to pay. But so I think that's where an expert could come in and say, and maybe more than one, this is what we think the consequences of this will be. And that's when but the final decision, as I say, is, I think, a fairly straightforward moral money decision, which we are all capable of making.
Okay, there were many more hands up, maybe from this side. Over here, the gentleman with the hat.
As an ex-DuPont employee, I find it absolutely terrible what happened in 1984. My question is another one. It seems very enticing to us, perhaps as small shareholders in large companies, to adopt your thesis. To what extent have you road tested this thesis with companies and CEOs themselves, and what has the reaction been?
Well, we've done more talking to asset managers. So we have spoken to people at Vanguard and BlackRock, and quite senior people there, and the reaction has been pretty lukewarm so far. We're trying to persuade them, but yeah, they're very conservative, small c, and it's not that easy. But as far as CEOs are concerned, I have less access to them, so I can't really report on that. But one bit of hope, so just from my perspective, is with the mutual funds. So the mutual funds are awfully powerful, the big three, right? They really have a lot of votes, and if you could get them to do it, I think that would be a game changer. And the thing is, the one sort of bit of hope there is they are under a lot of pressure. People point out that they have an enormous amount of power, and yet they are not the beneficiaries, right? The returns from the companies are flowing through to the investors in their funds, and yet the managers, the Larry Finks of this world, do the voting. So that puts them, and when a few years ago Larry Fink started talking about the environment, of course he got a lot of criticism from Republicans in Texas who threatened to take away pension funds from him, and he retreated. And now he's back to saying it's only a shareholder value that matters. But, he can be attacked for that as well. He could be attacked from the left for just focusing on money. The thing is that these guys have too much power, and they're worried about being broken up. And I think that it's clear the reason they tried pass-through voting was to relinquish some of that power and say, look, actually it's not us, it's our beneficiaries who are doing it. But it hasn't really worked with retail investors. So my hope is that they'll wake up one morning and say, you know what, the investor assembly is a way for us to relinquish power, and it'll actually work, and we'll be out of the hot seat.
Okay. There's someone over here, and then Harald there.
I'm very sympathetic to your assembly proposal. My concern is that the assembly might be corrupted. Think of yourself as the CEO. That assembly is a nuisance. They might come up with things that you don't like. So you might tweak already the selection process. You could see that the pension fund managers strike a sweetheart deal with you, that they are not going to impose those votes on you. Probably you have thought about safeguards, how you could assure the proper functioning of that assembly on the longer run. Thank you.
Yeah. I think you have to have an independent group doing the selection. You're not going to have the CEO of a company, of Exxon, doing the selection. And you're not going to have the CEO, you're not going to have the CEO of BlackRock or Vanguard or State Street doing the selection. It's got to be done by some independent group that will, that can be trusted. There's always, such problems always exist, but I don't think they're insurmountable in this case.
Okay, before we have the next question over here, maybe I take one from online. So people ask whether there are any technical innovations that could help kind of giving investors a voice, because kind of the citizen or investor assembly, that's kind of a very old-fashioned idea, maybe.
Well, okay, AI can surely help in some respects by summarizing articles, books, deliberations.
Or that you state generally your preferences and they are then aggregated and applied to...
No, I think maybe the discussion we've had, I mean, for example, these days, you know, you have a Zoom. I mean, I've actually with this Connecticut assembly, as part of the organization, there have been Zooms, and then, you know, at the end of it, you have a recording, which you can distribute, and you could also have some AI summarizing what was said at the meeting. So, you know, this could be very helpful for
keeping the assembly, but making that more efficient.
Yeah. But yes, it is also, and I'm sure there are other people here who understand AI much better and what it's capable of. But I think, let me stress something which I think is really key to the assembly, and it's deliberation. It's actually conversation, it's discussion. It's, this is what people report about citizens' assemblies. Elaine, by the way, I should advertise something here. Elaine Landemore has a new book. It just came out a few months ago, called Politics Without Politicians, and it's about citizens' assemblies. It's a very good title and a very good read. And she reports on how, you know, what's really amazing is you get this group of people together on contentious issues like end of life, something like that, very different views on this. And, you know, people start quite far apart and they learn from each other. And, you know, it sort of makes sense, doesn't it? You know, I have one view, you have another. Once we start talking, I begin to see your position, and you begin to understand my position. And, you know, we don't end up agreeing, but there's a lot of respect for there's a lot of learning and respect for the other person. And actually, even she says, love. Love is not, you know, people end up really having, becoming fond of the other people. And but I think the thing is, as economists, when we talk about preference aggregation, and we talk about clever voting schemes and all the rest of it, what that doesn't capture is the actual act of conversation and deliberation. And that's something that happens, you know, I don't think AI is going to substitute for that. It can happen in person. It can also apparently happen online. But it's got to be the people.
We will see what it is capable of. These were actually pretty good last words, but I promised Harald another question.
Yeah,
so
thank you for the fascinating talk and intriguing proposal. I just wonder whether giving people a choice and having competition between funds isn't the more elegant way to go. I mean, there's nothing wrong with Vanguard creating one fund that says we do return maximization, another fund that says we do responsible investing and we do green investing and so forth. In fact, these kinds of funds exist and people do make these choices. And I would be shocked if BlackRock goes into, let's say, a green investment fund and says, you know, to the hell with your covenant of only investing in green stuff, right? We want return maximization. They're probably bound by the covenant even there. And once you have competition between these funds, then people can just choose where to put their money without having to worry about every one of these 10,000 companies in there.
I'm all in favor of competition, but remember, what I'm interested in is engagement rather than, so if you decide you're going to invest in a green fund, you're basically getting out of dirty companies. And is that going to make those dirty companies behave better? No, because the new shareholders will be all in favor of dirt. That's why they bought the shares from you. So, and also, by the way, from a diversification point of view, you know, if you're not in oil stocks, you wouldn't have done very well in the last few years. So I think I'm most interested in index funds that cover everything, basically. But then the question is, can we push the companies in the fund to do better using our voting? Now, I think where the competition can come in is, Vanguard could say we're going to have two S&P 500 index funds, one with an investor assembly and one without an investor assembly. You choose. That's fine with me. You might say, and of course, you're from Chicago, right? The usual Chicago response is, well, why hasn't it happened if it's a good idea? But, I think there's a role for people to point out the error of people's ways. I think let's call it the Friedman doctrine, and it's not just because of him, but that is so deeply entrenched that it needs people to point out that it's wrong. And and that could then lead to these things being created, and then we'll see what the demand for them is. And by the way, I have no problem with a company, just as I don't really have a problem with someone retaining control of their company so that the shareholders really don't have any say. If they choose to do it, I'm okay with it. Equally, I would be okay with a company that when it's set up, in its charter says, we are a profit-maximizing company. Take it or leave it. That's fine. And then no investor assembly for that company will ever be needed, unless it's just, basically wouldn't. And similarly, if you're a mutual fund and you say, we're a mutual fund, we don't believe in investor assemblies, that's fine as well. But I just think there's a role for them somewhere.
Okay, thank you very much, Oliver, for presenting this idea, and we will see kind of where the obstacles might be to wide adoption. You mentioned this book, Politics Without Politicians. You mentioned also your book.
My book,
of course.
Yes.
But I wanted to keep up the idea of politics without...
Her book is out, and you can easily buy it.
Okay.
My book with Luigi, Citizen Investors, you're going to have to wait a bit till the end of next year, I think.
Okay, he also mentioned that book, but I wanted to close on something else, namely that I very much hope, after listening to you, that fewer people want to write the book Science Without Scientists. So thank you very much. Also, thank you very much for all here joining us today. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did, and I wish you a pleasant rest of the evening and a safe journey home. Thank you very much.